The lawyer cleared his throat, a dry rustle of paper and dust in the stagnant air of his office. He did not look at Alara. His gaze was fixed on a point just over her shoulder, as if addressing a ghost who stood behind her chair. Perhaps he was. Her husband, Thomas, had been dead for a month, buried under the hard, unforgiving soil of Prosperity Gulch, and his presence was a heavier weight in the room than her own. His family, the Gables, sat opposite her. Thomas's father, a man whose face seemed carved from granite and disapproval, held the family's judgment like a weapon. "As per my son's final wishes and our own generosity," Mr. Gable began, his voice flat and devoid of any warmth, "we have settled his accounts. Ilara, you will receive the deed to the 40 acres at Blackwater Bend." He slid a folded document across the polished desk. It stopped inches from her hand. The lawyer nudged it closer with a pristine finger. Ilara knew of Blackwater Bend. Everyone did. It was not land. It was a swamp. A low, marshy tract that flooded every spring and bred mosquitoes all summer. It was considered the most useless parcel in the entire county, a place where the earth refused to hold a foundation and the water soured the air. It was a joke, and she was the punchline. "And this," Mr. Gable continued, placing a small, thin leather pouch on the desk. It landed with a pathetic clink. $20 to help you get started, or to purchase a ticket back to wherever it is you came from." The implication was clear. They were not just settling a debt, they were erasing a mistake. Their son had married a foreigner, a woman with a strange accent and ways they did not understand, and now that he was gone, she was a loose thread to be snipped. She looked at the faces of her husband's family. There was no grief for their son, only a cold, hard resolve to close a chapter. They had never approved of her. To them, she was the strange woman who had lured their boy away with foreign charms. Now she was just a problem to be disposed of with a piece of worthless paper and a handful of coins. The entire town of Prosperity Gulch seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what the widow would do. They expected tears, begging, a collapse into helpless sorrow. Ilara reached out, her hand steady, and took the deed. Her fingers curled around the stiff paper. Then she picked up the pouch. The coins were cold and light. She did not count them. She knew the amount was an insult, calculated to be just enough to make her disappear but not enough to give her a foothold. She stood, her worn dress falling straight to the floor. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was quiet but clear, the accent they so disliked clipping the edges of the words. She did not look at them with hatred or with sadness. She looked at them with a profound and unnerving stillness, as if she were observing a peculiar type of insect. She turned and walked out of the lawyer's office, the bell over the door chiming her departure, into the cold street. The town had cast her out. She had a worthless deed, $20, the clothes on her back, and a memory of how to build a home where no one else thought one could stand. She did not walk to the stagecoach office. She walked to the Mercantile. The journey to Blackwater Bend was a pilgrimage into desolation. She carried her new purchases on her back, a sharp scythe, a good axe, a small spade, and a sack containing salt, flour, and a handful of seeds. The weight was a brutal reminder of her new reality. Every step took her further from the wooden sidewalks of Prosperity Gulch and deeper into a landscape that grew progressively wilder and less forgiving. The rolling hills gave way to flat, damp ground, and the tall pines were replaced by stunted, waterlogged willows and skeletal cottonwoods. The air changed. It grew heavy, thick with the smell of wet earth and decaying vegetation. The silence was broken only by the hum of insects and the mournful cry of unseen birds. She walked for hours, following a barely there trail that eventually dissolved into muddy tracks. By the time she reached the marker stake that denoted the edge of her property, a cold dread had settled deep in her bones. She stood and looked out at her inheritance. It was worse than the stories. A vast expanse of tall, brown reeds stretched to the horizon, broken by pools of stagnant black water. The ground beneath her feet was a sponge, yielding with a wet sigh at every step. A persistent, chilling wind swept across the flats, cutting through her thin coat like a knife. There were no trees of any substance, no high ground, no solid rock. It was a place of rot and water and wind. For a long moment she allowed despair to wash over her. The town was right. The gables were right. This was a grave, not a home. They had sent her here to fail, to be swallowed by the mud and forgotten. Her throat tightened, and the sting of tears burned behind her eyes. She felt the crushing weight of her solitude, a physical pressure that made it hard to breathe. What could she possibly build here? A house of mud would dissolve, a wooden shack would sink. She sank to her knees, the damp cold immediately seeping through the fabric of her dress. She let the sack of tools slide to the ground. She was alone, in a foreign land, with nothing but a swamp. But as she knelt there, head bowed, something caught her attention. The wind, which had been so relentless on the open trail, was not as sharp here. She looked up. The reeds, standing 10 feet tall in a dense, impenetrable wall, were breaking its force. Inside the thicket, the air was almost still. She pushed herself to her feet and waded into the reeds. It was like entering another world. The sound of the wind became a distant whisper. The air felt warmer, sheltered. She ran her hand along the stalk of a reed. It was hollow, yet strong and fibrous. She remembered her grandmother in the old country talking about the reeds that grew by their own river. "They are the breath of the house," she used to say. "They hold the warmth in winter and the cool in summer." Alara looked down at the ground again, this time with a different eye. She scraped away the layer of dead leaves and black topsoil. Beneath it was not mud, but a thick, heavy gray substance. Clay. It was dense and sticky, clinging to her fingers. She rolled a piece of it in her palm. It held its shape perfectly. Clay for bricks, clay for mortar, clay for plaster. And then she saw it. Not with her eyes, but with a sudden, electrifying clarity of mind. The Gables, in their scorn, had given her the two things she needed most. They had given her an endless supply of the finest insulation known to her people, the hollow, air-trapping reeds. And they had given her an endless supply of the binder that would hold it all together, the thick, waterproof clay. They thought they had given her a swamp. They had given her a quarry. The despair vanished, replaced by a cold, hard fire of resolve. She would not just survive here. She would build a home that the stone-faced men in their drafty wooden houses could not even imagine. She picked up her scythe. The work began. The first task was the harvest. For weeks she did nothing but cut reeds. The scythe, a gleaming crescent of new steel, became an extension of her arm. She swung it from dawn until dusk, the rhythmic shh of the blade slicing through the hollow stalks, the only sound for miles. Her hands, soft from a life that had not required such labor, were quickly rubbed raw. Blisters formed, broke, and bled. The skin thickened into calluses as hard as leather. She worked in sections, clearing patches of ground and stacking the reeds in enormous, house-sized piles to dry. The sheer volume of material she required was staggering. She was not gathering reeds for a basket or a mat. She was gathering them for walls, for insulation, for a roof that would be 3 feet thick. Her muscles screamed in protest. Her back ached with a fire that never fully went out. At night she would collapse in a temporary lean-to, a crude shelter of branches and reeds, and fall into a sleep so deep it was like a small death, only to wake at first light, stiff and sore, and begin again. While the reeds dried, she turned to the trees. The few cottonwoods and willows on the property were thin and crooked, useless for the grand log walls of the houses in Prosperity Gulch. But they were perfect for a timber frame. She felled them with the axe, the sharp reports echoing across the marsh. The work was slow and punishing. Each tree had to be limbed, then cut to length with a small hand, saw that bucked and bit in the green wood. She was not a woodcutter, but she learned. She learned to read the lean of a tree, to wedge it properly, to use her own body weight to power the saw. She dug pits for the foundation posts, not deep, but wide, and filled them with rocks she hauled one by one from a creek bed a mile away. On this bed of stones she raised the frame of her house. It was a simple structure, low and long, with a steeply pitched roof line. It looked like a skeleton, a fragile suggestion of a house against the vast flat landscape. Passers-by on the distant trail, had there been any, would have laughed at the flimsy-looking thing, section. But the frame was only the beginning. Now came the part that would have baffled any builder in Prosperity Gulch. She began to weave the walls. Using the most flexible willow branches, she created a lattice between the upright timbers, a tight mesh of woven wood known as wattle. It was the basket that would hold the heart of the house. With the wattle in place, she prepared the daub. She dug clay by the cartload, a handmade wheelbarrow groaning under the weight. She mixed it in a shallow pit with water, chopped reeds and dry grasses. She stomped it with her bare feet, the cold, slick clay squelching up between her toes until it was the perfect consistency, a thick, fibrous plaster. Then she began to build her walls. She did not use bricks or logs. She used the daub. She packed it into the wattle frame, forcing it into every crevice, building it up layer by layer, inside and out. But this was no simple plastering. Into the heart of the daub she packed the reeds, not chopped, but whole bundles of them, laid horizontally, thousands upon thousands of them, creating a core of trapped air within the clay walls. Her walls grew to be 2 feet thick, a monstrous thickness that seemed absurd. It was slow, back-breaking work, smoothing the clay with her hands, her arms coated to the elbows in gray mud. While the walls cured slowly in the autumn sun, she built the hearth. It was the soul of the house, and she gave it the most attention. She hauled more stones from the creek, larger ones this time, and built a massive raised fireplace and chimney base at the center of the structure. It was not just a fireplace. It was a thermal battery. The sheer mass of stone was designed to soak up the heat from the fire and then radiate it slowly back into the room for hours after the flames died down. It was a principle of physics her ancestors had understood for 1,000 years. For water, she dug a well. The high water table that made the land a swamp was now her ally. She only had to dig 10 feet before she hit clean, cold water filtered by the layers of sand and clay. She lined the well with more stones, creating a permanent, reliable source of life just steps from her door. The final piece of the shelter was the roof. This was the most critical and difficult task. A leaky roof would mean ruin. She built a sturdy frame of poles, then began to lay the reeds. It was a form of weaving called thatching. She tied bundles of reeds together and fastened them to the roof laths, starting at the bottom and working her way up, each new layer overlapping the last. The process was agonizingly slow. She had to get the angle just right, the density perfect. The finished roof was a thick, shaggy blanket, 3 feet of compressed reeds, designed to shed water completely and provide an almost impenetrable layer of insulation above. Her house was taking shape. It looked alien in the landscape of the American West. It was low to the ground, with rounded, organic-looking walls of gray clay. It had no sharp corners. Its deep-set windows were small, and its thatched roof looked like the bristling pelt of some enormous, sleeping animal. It did not dominate the landscape. It seemed to have grown out of it. With the shelter complete, she turned to food. The marshy soil was useless for traditional farming, so she built raised garden beds. She constructed wooden frames and filled them with layers of rich river mud, composted reeds, and the precious few bags of topsoil she laboriously hauled from a hillside on the far edge of her property. In these beds she planted the seeds she had bought: hardy greens, potatoes, onions and beans that could withstand the coming cold. One day, in late autumn, she walked the long miles back to Prosperity Gulch. Her appearance caused a stir at the Mercantile. Her face was weathered by sun and wind, her hands were the hands of a laborer, and her dress was stained with clay. She ignored the whispers and the stares. She walked to the counter where Mr. Gable stood, polishing a glass jar. "I need to buy some geese," she said, her voice steady. Gable looked up, his expression a mixture of pity and contempt. "Geese? What in God's name for? There is nothing for you out in that bog, girl. You are wasting your time and your money. That mud hut of yours will melt in the first winter rain." "The house will stand," Ilara replied calmly. "I need 6 geese and a gander." A trapper named Brant, who was leaning against the counter, let out a harsh laugh. He was a big man, full of rough confidence and easy cruelty. "The marsh witch wants some feathered friends," he bellowed to the other men in the store. "Building a nest out there in the reeds, are you? Be careful it does not sink into the muck with you in it." The men chuckled. The mockery was open now, a shared town sport. Ilara's folly was a source of great entertainment. She did not react. She laid her coins on the counter, counted out the price for the birds, and waited. Gable, shaking his head, took the money and directed her to a pen behind the store. She led her small flock of geese back to the marsh. The journey was slow, the birds honking and complaining the entire way. But as they neared Blackwater Bend, they seemed to sense the water. They grew excited, their pace quickening. When she released them, they rushed into the pools and channels with joyous honks, immediately at home in the environment that humans found so hostile. They would be her companions, her source of eggs and down, and, as it would turn out, her sentinels. The gander, a large, proud bird with fierce, intelligent eyes, quickly attached himself to her, following her everywhere, hissing at any perceived threat. She was no longer entirely alone. The nickname stuck. In the conversations at the Mercantile, in the pews after Sunday service, in the quiet gossip over fence posts, she became the Marsh Witch. The stories grew more elaborate. Brant, the trapper, claimed to have seen her stirring pots of mud under the full moon. Mr. Gable told anyone who would listen that the woman was building a house of wet dirt and grass, a project of pure insanity. He would often tap his temple when he said her name, a gesture of pity for the poor, mad widow. One afternoon, Brant rode his horse out to her property, curiosity and malice warring in his expression. He stopped at a distance, surveying her strange-looking home. Ilara was on the roof, making a final adjustment to the thatch. She saw him, but did not acknowledge him. "That thing will be a pile of mud by spring," he shouted, his voice carrying easily across the flat land. "You will freeze or drown in that mud pie, woman. There is still time to admit you were wrong and come back to town. The church has a charity cot for folks like you." Ilara paused her work. She looked down at him, a small, resolute figure, against the enormous sky. She did not shout back. She simply shook her head once, a small, firm gesture of refusal, and returned to her task. Brant snorted in disgust, wheeled his horse around, and galloped away, the story of his visit and her stubborn pride becoming the next chapter in the town's folklore about her. As autumn deepened into winter, her world shrank to the small circle of warmth and life she had built. A routine took hold, governed by the light of the sun and the needs of the day. Each morning began in the pre-dawn chill. She would stir the embers in the great stone hearth, adding new logs until a steady fire drove back the darkness. The stone, still warm from the night before, would begin to soak in the new heat. Her days were a quiet rhythm of chores. She fed the geese, their boisterous honking a welcome sound in the profound silence. She checked the water in the well. She tended the small green shoots in her raised beds, which were covered at night by insulating blankets of woven reeds. She checked her walls and roof for any signs of weakness, any place where the cold might find a way in. Her life was a constant process of maintenance and vigilance. The isolation was absolute. Weeks went by without her seeing another human soul. The world of Prosperity Gulch, with its gossip and its judgment, felt as distant as the moon. Here in her small kingdom of clay and reeds, she was the sovereign. There was a peace in the solitude, a deep satisfaction in the competence of her own two hands. She was not just surviving, she was in control. The house was her partner in this endeavor. It breathed with her, holding the warmth she created, sheltering her from the wind that howled endlessly outside. The first test came in late November. A storm rolled in from the northwest, not with snow, but with a driving, freezing rain that lasted for 3 days. It was the kind of storm Mr. Gable had predicted would be her ruin. The wind tore at the land, and the rain came down in sheets, turning the marsh into a single, vast lake. Inside her house, Ilara listened. She heard the wind as a low moan, a distant complaint rather than an immediate threat. The thick walls muffled its fury. She heard the rain drumming on the thick thatch of her roof, a sound like 1,000 soft fingers, but not a single drop made its way through. She stayed dry and warm, the fire in the hearth crackling cheerfully. She had built drainage ditches around her home, and they worked perfectly, channeling the floodwaters away from her foundation. When the storm finally broke and a pale sun emerged, her house stood firm and untouched, a small island of order in a world of chaotic water. It worked. The town was wrong. The winter of '83 began in earnest in the middle of December. It did not arrive gently. It came like a hammer blow, a wave of Arctic air that sent the temperature plummeting to depths no one could remember. Then the snow began. It was not a gentle, picturesque snowfall. It was a blizzard, a churning, blinding wall of white that erased the world. The wind screamed like a banshee, a constant, high-pitched assault that clawed at the walls of every structure in the county. In Prosperity Gulch, the reality of the storm set in quickly. The log cabins and frame houses, built with pride and conventional wisdom, were no match for this cold. The wind forced its way through every crack, every chink in the mortar, every gap in the floorboards. It was a physical thief, stealing the heat almost as fast as the fires could produce it. Families huddled around their stoves, wrapped in every blanket they owned, yet still they shivered. The consumption of firewood was terrifying. A cord of wood that should have lasted a month was gone in a week. The stacks behind the houses dwindled with alarming speed. The sound of axes biting into frozen wood rang through the town, day and night, a frantic percussion against the howl of the wind. Mr. Gable's mercantile, its windows frosted thick with ice, became a grim gathering place where men spoke in low, worried tones about their dwindling supplies. Roofs, not built for such a heavy load, began to groan and sag under the immense weight of the accumulating snow. The town's confidence, its very sense of order, was shattering. Outside, the world had become an alien landscape. The snow buried fences, erased roads, and drifted into massive dunes that changed shape with the wind. To be caught outside was a death sentence. Livestock, trapped in barns that were little better than wind tunnels, began to freeze to death where they stood. The community, so sure of its methods and its mastery over the land, was being broken. Their sturdy, reliable world had failed them utterly, but miles away, in the heart of Blackwater Bend, there was a small pocket of stillness. Inside the Reed house, the great storm was a distant rumor. The 2-foot-thick walls of clay and reed absorbed the wind's fury, rendering its scream into a muffled hum. The 3-foot-thick thatched roof held the weight of the snow easily, the snow itself becoming another layer of insulation. Ilara was not fighting the storm. She was living outside its reach. The massive stone hearth, its core heated to a deep, resonant warmth, radiated a steady, gentle heat throughout the single room. The air was warm and dry, Her geese were sheltered in a small alcove she had built into the side of the house, content and safe. Her raised beds, covered by a thick mound of snow, were protected, the hardy roots of her vegetables dormant but alive in the insulated earth beneath. She had a mountain of firewood stacked against the interior wall, and she used it sparingly, for the house held its heat so efficiently that a large fire was only needed for a few hours each day. She was warm, she was safe. She had water from her well and food from her stores. The systems she had built with her own bleeding hands were holding. She was the master of her small, warm world, while the world of the people who had scorned her was freezing to death. Brant the trapper had misjudged the storm. He had been checking his trap lines miles to the north when the sky turned the color of lead and the world dissolved into white. He was a man of the wilderness, confident in his skills, but this was a force beyond his experience. The wind was a physical wall, stealing his breath and blinding him with ice particles that felt like needles on his exposed skin. His horse, a sturdy mountain-bred animal, faltered and fell, lost to the deepening drifts. He was on foot, hopelessly lost. His own cabin was a day's walk in good weather. In this blizzard, it might as well have been on the other side of the continent. The cold was a living thing, seeping through his thick coat, draining the strength from his limbs. His feet became numb, clumsy blocks of wood. His mind began to fog. He knew he was dying. He stumbled on, driven by some primal instinct, with no sense of direction, just a desperate need to move. He fell, and as he lay in the snow, the seductive warmth of hypothermia began to creep over him. He was ready to give up, to let the white silence take him. And then he heard it. A sound that did not belong in the storm's chaos. A faint, rhythmic honking. It was so out of place, he thought his freezing brain was inventing it. But it came again, louder this time, insistent. A guide. He staggered to his feet and lurched toward the sound. It was the last conscious act he was capable of. Through the swirling snow he saw a flicker of light, a faint yellow glow where no light should be. He stumbled toward it, falling again and again, crawling the last few feet until his hand struck something solid. Wood. A door. He banged on it with what was left of his strength, a weak, desperate drumming, before the world went black. Ilara was startled by the sound. It was the gander first, hissing and honking his alarm from the shelter of his alcove. Then the banging on the door. Her heart leaped into her throat. No one could be out in this. It was impossible. She grabbed a heavy iron poker from the hearth and cautiously unbarred the thick wooden door. The wind ripped it from her hand, slamming it open against the interior wall. A blast of Arctic air and a swirl of snow invaded her warm sanctuary. Sprawled on her doorstep was a mound of white that she first took for a snowdrift, but then realized was a man. She did not recognize him at first, his face caked with ice, his beard a frozen mass. For a single, cold moment, she hesitated. Her mind flashed back to the mercantile, to the jeering laughter, to the cruel nickname. This was the world that had cast her out, now lying frozen on her threshold. It was justice, perhaps. A bitter, satisfying justice. She could close the door, and the storm would finish its work. No one would ever know. Her carefully rationed resources, her food, her firewood, would remain hers alone. But the moment passed. The calculation of resources and the memory of scorn were weighed against the simple, undeniable fact of a human being dying at her feet. She could not do it. Not because he deserved her help, but because she was capable of giving it. That was the only thing that mattered. With a grunt of effort, she grabbed the collar of his heavy coat and dragged him inside. He was a dead weight, a frozen side of beef. It took all of her strength to haul him across the floor and away from the door, which she then forced shut against the raging storm, barring it once more. The man who had called her the Marsh Witch lay unconscious on her floor, his life now resting entirely in her hands. She set to work, cutting away his frozen clothes, rubbing his numb limbs back to life, forcing warm broth between his cracked lips. She was saving the man who had mocked her most. Brant awoke to a sensation so foreign and profound it took him a long moment to identify it. Warmth. A deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to rise from the very floor and radiate from the walls. He was lying on a soft bed of furs near a massive stone hearth where a low fire danced. He was dressed in clothes that were not his own, a rough but clean wool shirt and trousers. He sat up, his muscles aching, his head pounding, and stared. The room was a miracle. The air was still and dry. There were no drafts. He looked at the walls, thick and gray and slightly curved. He reached out and touched the one nearest him. It was not cold. It felt neutral, almost warm itself. He saw the small, deep-set windows, their thick glass clear of frost. He saw shelves neatly stacked with jars of preserved food, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters of the thatched roof, and in a corner, a small patch of green where plants grew in a wooden box under a cleverly placed piece of polished tin that reflected the firelight. He could not reconcile this place with the stories, with his own mockery. This was not a damp, sinking mud hut. This was a fortress. It was the warmest, most secure building he had ever been in. He saw Elara across the room tending to a pot over the fire. She moved with a quiet, efficient grace. She was not a witch. She was a builder, an architect of survival. "You were nearly frozen solid," she said without turning around. Her voice was calm, without a trace of triumph or accusation. "The gander heard you." Shame washed over him, a heat more intense than that from the fire. "We called you a fool," he rasped, his throat raw. "My God, we were the fools." He looked around the room again, seeing the intelligence in every detail, the thermal mass of the hearth, the insulating thickness of the walls, the genius of the thatched roof. "How?" he asked, the single word encompassing a universe of questions. "It is an old way," she said simply, ladling more broth into a bowl. "The reeds hold the air, the clay holds the heat, the earth provides." She brought him the bowl. "Eat. You need your strength." Section. He ate in humbled silence. For 2 days, as the blizzard raged outside, he recovered in her impossible house. She spoke little, but her actions were a constant lesson in resourcefulness and grace. She shared her food, her warmth, and her shelter without ever once reminding him of his cruelty. She did not want an apology. She did not want his gratitude. She simply did what was necessary. On the 3rd day, the storm broke. The wind died down, and a weak, watery sun appeared in the sky. The world outside was a terrifying landscape of white, drifts piled 20 feet high. Brant knew people in town would be in desperate trouble. He had to go back. As he prepared to leave, a frantic pounding shook the door. Elara opened it to find a young man, barely a boy, his face raw with cold and fear. It was Mr. Gable's eldest son. He stared at Brant, his eyes wide with shock, and then at the warm, orderly room behind him. "Brant, we thought you were dead," the boy cried. "Father sent me to find you. Our firewood is almost gone. My mother and the baby, they are so cold. The house is like ice." He looked past Brant at Elara, his expression confused. He was standing on the threshold of the mad woman's mud hut, and it was a haven. Elara looked from the boy's desperate face to Brant's ashamed one. She felt no victory, only a weary sense of the world's foolishness. She turned back to the boy. Her response was simple, direct, and it changed everything. "There is warmth here," she said. "Bring your family." The news spread through Prosperity Gulch like wildfire in a dry season. First, Brant returned, not with tales of the marsh witch's folly, but with a sled loaded with bundles of dry reeds and a story of impossible warmth and quiet grace. He told of her walls, her hearth, her foresight. Then the Gable family, their faces gaunt with cold and worry, were led through the snow to the low, gray house in the marsh. They entered a world of warmth and safety that their own fine timber-framed house could no longer provide. After the great blizzard finally receded, a procession of townspeople made the journey to Blackwater Bend. They came not to mock, but to see. They walked into her home, their boots clumping on the hard-packed earth floor, and they fell silent. They touched the warm clay walls, staring in disbelief. They felt the steady, draft-free heat from the stone hearth. They saw the healthy geese, the small but thriving indoor garden. They saw a system, a science of survival they had arrogantly dismissed. Mr. Gable stood before Elara in the center of the room he had sworn would melt in the first rain. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a deep and profound humility. "We were wrong," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We scorned you, and you saved my family. There are no words." Elara simply nodded. She did not need words. The house spoke for her. The warmth spoke for her. Her survival was her statement. She offered them hot tea and showed them how she wove the reeds, how she mixed the clay, how the shape of the roof shed the snow. She gave her knowledge away as freely as she had given her warmth. The transformation of Prosperity Gulch began that spring. The derisive nickname, the Marsh Witch, was never spoken again. Instead, she was called Elara, or the Woman from the Bend, her name now uttered with a deep and abiding respect. Men came to her, not with charity, but with requests for advice. They began to rebuild, but this time they built differently. They harvested the endless reeds from the marsh, the very resource they had considered a sign of worthlessness. They learned to mix the clay and build thick, insulated walls. The new houses that rose from the devastation of the blizzard were lower, sturdier, and far warmer. The worthless swamp, her pitiful inheritance, became the source of the town's renewal. Blackwater Bend was no longer a joke. It was a symbol of ingenuity. Years passed. Elara never left her home in the marsh. It became a landmark, a testament to resilience. Travelers passing through would hear the story of the foreign woman who taught a town how to survive a winter that should have destroyed them. Her methods spread to neighboring settlements, and the sight of low, thick-walled houses with thatched roofs began to appear throughout the territory. She lived a long and peaceful life. She never remarried, finding a quiet contentment in her solitude, though she was never truly alone. The people of the town became her friends, bringing her goods to trade for her advice, her goose eggs, or simply to share a cup of tea in the unshakable warmth of her home. In her old age, she would often sit outside her front door in the evenings, the old gander's descendant at her feet, and watch the sun set over the reeds. The light would catch the shimmering water and paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. She had been sent to this place as an exile, given nothing but what others considered trash. But from that rejection, with her own 2 hands, she had built not just a shelter, but a life, a legacy, and a community. She had proven that true worth is not found in what you are given, but in what you have the vision to create.